So I've been noticing a debate online recently about a social media company named Gab. If you're unfamiliar with Gab, it started as a free speech alternative to Twitter, but due to the number of right-wingers who were banned or driven off different social media platforms, Gab quickly became a platform dominated by right-wing opinions that have been driven out of the public square and can only be expressed in a platform that is completely dedicated to allowing that kind of speech. And due to Gab's dedication to continue to allow that kind of speech on its platform, it's had to do all kinds of crazy things. It's had to endure all kinds of crazy attempts to silence and censor it. It's had to deal with attacks on its ability to process payments, keep bank accounts. It's had to deal with attacks on its ability to have hosting, its servers, everything that goes with access to the internet. And at least as I understand it, and I'm no expert when it comes to these type of things, but as far as it has been explained to me, Gab has done basically everything it possibly can to make itself uncancelable. Unless, like, the FBI goes in and rips up the office and throws the servers in a trash can, there's nothing people can really do to take it offline. Not that I'm saying I would count that possibility out at all, especially under a Biden administration, but let's say they've done basically everything they can. They've gone to great lengths to make it as hard as possible to keep them from their mission of keeping this platform up and open and people being able to post what they want to it. Now, where the controversy comes in is that many of the people who are right-wing and use Gab have made some serious complaints about the people who run the site. Gab's leadership is pretty aggressively Christian in public. They're very loud on, ironically, their own Twitter account about their Christianity. They often post some pretty cheesy memes, admittedly, about Christianity on their account, this kind of thing. They do it on a very regular basis. And what I hear from a lot of people who are right-wing but not Christian, or just find this level of being explicit about the religious beliefs of the company to be off-putting, are things like, hey, why can't you just be a neutral, free speech alternative to Twitter? Why do you have to explicitly state these beliefs? Why do you have to push them constantly? Why do you have to let them impact the site? Why can't you just be a neutral site that doesn't censor people and lets people say what they want, and just keep these views to yourself? Don't let them actually impact the running of the company. Don't make them public all the time. Now, before we get too far into the video, I want to make clear this is not me rushing out to white knight for Gab. I don't have a Gab account. I've never really been on Gab. Maybe I'll end up there one day if I stop using Twitter, but Twitter does far more for what I want to do with my social media than Gab does. So this is not me running out there to defend my favorite social media company. But I do think there's a serious flaw in the logic of people who are asking this question about Gab, saying, why can't you just be neutral? Why can't you just keep your opinions to yourself? Why can't you just be Twitter but you're not censoring me? Why can't you just be a neutral free speech alternative? And again, I'm not here to defend Gab saying, hey, it has to do exactly what it's doing and exactly the way it's doing it, but I do think there's a serious mistake in believing that there is such a thing as a neutral institution. And as people on the right, it is absolutely essential that we understand why this is impossible. The idea of a neutral institution is a myth of liberalism. It is a fiction, and we need to be careful not to fall back into it. We need to be careful not to fall back into these assumptions that we can just kind of go back to the 1990s, and that will be what's best. That's what will fix the situation. We need to understand why that is unsustainable, why that is not something that will continue into the future. But to understand that, we need to understand a more basic law of politics. Actually, we need to understand 3 laws of politics. So the historian Rober Conquest famously has 3 laws of politics. 1. Everyone is conservative about what he knows best. 2. Any organization not explicitly right-wing sooner or later becomes left-wing. And 3. The simplest way to explain the behavior of any bureaucratic organization is to assume that it is controlled by a cabal of its enemies. These 3 laws are actually very key to understanding some of the ideas inside neo-reactionary political philosophy. With the explosion of the popularity of the cathedral model, most people think this is really all there is to neo-reaction. That's all they really know about this kind of political analysis. But if you only stop there, if you don't go any deeper into the actual roots, then I think you're really missing some of the key ideas that help you unlock and understand the world around you, and the things that we're seeing unfold politically today. One of Curtis Yarvin's most important contributions, one of the things that he is famous for saying, is that Cthulhu always swims, but he always swims to the left. And understanding Conquest's laws, understanding the left as entropy, will really help us understand what that means. And so that's what we're going to go ahead and do in today's video. So Conquest's first law is the one that is probably the least controversial, the one that you can get a lot of people to agree with. Everyone is conservative about what he knows best. And this is really simply to say that we protect that which we are most invested in. If we have spent time, if we have put effort into something, if we have invested in a system or in an organization or in a family or whatever it is, an ideology, it doesn't matter. If we have put our time into it, if we are familiar and comfortable with it, if it means something to us, we are most likely to be conservative about that kind of thing. We are probably much more likely to gatekeep that kind of thing. We're much more likely to protect it. We're much more likely to try to maintain it. That thing doesn't even have to be right-wing, right? We're just talking about conserving something, protecting it. I mean, you can see this with the post-leftists, right? You have people out there who were dedicated Marxists, they were dedicated to the revolution, and now people want to turn Marxism into something else. They want to turn it into the woke stuff, right? So even something that is in no way right-wing still falls under the purview of this law. If you're invested in something, if you know something best, if you are personally involved in it and have put blood, sweat, and tears into it, you are far more likely to try to conserve it. Again, I don't think you'd have to work too hard to convince people of this one. I don't think you're going to get a lot of argument from most people. This is not the spiciest of Conquest's laws. So let's move to law number 2. Any organization not explicitly right-wing, sooner or later becomes left-wing. Now, this is the law that gets all the attention, and understandably so, right? This is the one that's going to answer our question from earlier about Gab and the idea of neutral institutions. But what we want to understand here is why. Why is this the case? If you look at the last few hundred years of history, I think a lot of people will make the argument, and rightly so, that things always seem to be moving in a leftward direction, in a progressive direction, that attitudes and culture and everything else is really liberalizing on a continuous basis. And the question we want to answer again is, why does that seem to be the case? Now, one answer that you would hear from someone who probably supports all this kind of stuff is, look, the left is always correct. They are the ones who have the best ideas. It is the most obvious way forward. It's what's best for humanity. And so it's always winning out. But even if I agreed with the left always being morally correct, which I clearly don't, it would be odd if they always won. Right? It would be odd if ideas that are the correct one always win. That seems like a very convenient narrative for the people who want to justify it, but it doesn't seem like one that is very realistic. So if we're honestly looking at this situation in history, that seems to always have this leftward progression. But we're not buying into the idea that the left is always correct about everything all the time, and that their good and superior ideas always win out over time. Then we need to look for another answer. When someone is making a great movie, people often talk about the vision of the director, the singular vision, the driving creative force of this auteur who's going to come out and realize what they're seeing in their head in the art of their movie, and this is what's going to create a great piece of film. What you rarely hear is someone coming out and saying what makes a movie great is a bunch of studio executives all getting involved and giving a bunch of notes and pulling the process in a bunch of different directions. In fact, you will specifically hear people complain about movies made by committee. We have phrases like this all the time, right? Too many cooks spoil the pot. Too many chiefs, not enough Indians. We kind of intuitively understand that when you have too many people involved in discussing and debating and parsing everything about what's being done, you end up with an inferior product. You end up with something that is worse than if one single person with a singular vision was driving a bunch of people all towards that goal. And I think the reason for that, whether we're talking about a movie or a government or a civilization or an institution or whatever we're talking about, I think it's easy to understand why that is. When something is first created for a particular purpose, and only that purpose, that is often when it does its job the best. There's a building period, there's a creation period where it has to get up to peak performance, but once it gets up to a certain level, once it starts doing that at its best, the only thing that can kind of happen to it after a certain point is decline. As different people start pulling it in different directions, we simply see organizations or institutions or civilizations or even movies fall apart when too many people with too many disparate interests start getting involved in the discussion. I've talked about this kind of thing before in previous videos when I've discussed the role of tradition in society. Creating a functioning society is hard. It is the outlier. It is the aberration. And so when a group of people do actually create one of these high cultures, one of these peaks of civilization, it becomes incredibly important to protect it by encoding the lessons that your ancestors learned into something that can transmit that knowledge into the future so people don't have to relearn those lessons. This is the main purpose of tradition, is to pass that knowledge down from generation to generation. But, of course, this never lasts forever, right? Every civilization eventually wears down. People forget about the cost that was paid to learn the lessons. People forget why they practiced the tradition in the first place. People forget what life is like without these barriers to their behavior in place. Competing interests start saying, but do we really need this one? Do we really have to keep doing this way? Is this really helping anyone out at the end of the day? Does this really serve the kind of problems that we're dealing with right now? And slowly but surely, the tradition gets worn away every year, bit by bit, until eventually we start seeing the collapse of that civilization as it loses its founding principles, it loses its identity, it loses the things that allowed it to become great in the first place, and it falls into decay and disrepair. This is true for organizations and institutions and civilizations and families and religions on all levels. This is a constant process. This is a natural process of entropy. Order is not the natural state of the world. Civilization is not the natural state of the world. Chaos is the natural state, and chaos will always wear away at these monoliths of order and civilization. And this is why it will always look like history is constantly moving to the left. This is why it will always look like Cthulhu is swimming to the left, because this is the process of entropy, which is always ongoing and which we can never escape. In his essay, The Dark Enlightenment, Nick Land expands on this subject very well when he discusses dialectics and the role they play in this process. Land famously says that the left thrives on dialectics while the right perishes through them, and that an integrative public debate always moves things to the left. Land says, quote, "The dialectic begins with political agitation and extends no further than its practical, antagonistic, factional, and coalitional logic. It is the superstructure for itself, or against natural limitations, practically appropriating the political sphere in its broadest graspable extension as a platform for social domination. Everywhere that there is an argument, there is an unresolved opportunity to rule. The cathedral incarnates these lessons. It has no need to espouse Leninism or operational communist dialectics, because it recognizes nothing else. There is scarcely a fragment of the social superstructure that has escaped dialectical reconstruction through articulate antagonism, polarization, binary structuring, and reversal. Within academia, the media, even the fine arts, political superstration has prevailed, identifying even the most minuscule elements of apprehension with conflictual social critique and egalitarian teleology. Communism is the universal implication. More dialectics is more politics, and more politics means progress, or social migration to the left. The production of public agreement only leads in one direction, and within public disagreement, such impetus already exists in embryo. It is only the absence of agreement and of public articulated disagreement, which is to say, in non-dialectics, non-argument, subpolitical diversity, or politically uncoordinated initiative that the right-wing refuge of the economy and civil society more widely is to be found. When no agreement is necessary or coercively demanded, negative or libertarian liberty is still possible, and this non-argumentative other of dialectics is easily formulated, even if, in a free society, it doesn't need to be. Do your own thing. Quite clearly, this irresponsible and negligent imperative is politically intolerable. It coincides exactly with the leftist depression, retrogression, or depoliticalization. Nothing cries out more urgently to be argued against. At the opposite extreme lies the dialectical ecstasy of theatrical justice, in which the argumentative structure of the legal proceeding is coupled with the publicization through the media. Dialectical enthusiasm finds its definitive expression in our courtroom drama that combines lawyers, journalists, community activists, and other agents of the revolutionary superstructure in the production of a show trial. Social contradictions are staged, antagonistic cases are articulated, and resolution institutionally expected. This is Hegel for primetime television, and now for the internet. It is the way that the cathedral shares its message with the people." End quote. Once the core values of a civilization are up for debate, they are over. Once something like this has entered the arena of an open discussion, it will always and inevitably move to the left. It will always and inevitably be worn away by this discussion. Any family, any organization, any civilization, any tradition that is not actively fighting against this kind of entropy will fall to it. Anyone who is not putting up barriers and defending and gatekeeping the things that they love and care about will watch them decay and be destroyed by this process. And even with those efforts, these things will still always eventually move to the left. Growth, building, collapse, and rebirth are all natural parts of the cycle, and no one ever truly escapes them. So no, you can't have neutral institutions, because any institution which is not explicitly defending its core values on purpose on a regular basis will see them shift, will see them decay. Now we move to Conquest's third law, and I think this one is sometimes seen as the redheaded stepchild of the three. It's the one that people look at and they say, this isn't particularly insightful, or they don't immediately understand what he means by it, but I think it's just as important as the other two. Conquest's third law is that the simplest way to explain the behavior of any bureaucratic organization is to assume that it is controlled by a cabal of its enemies. And this takes us back to rule by committee, right? Eventually things get too large to be ruled by one person. They become too big to be moved forward by a singular vision, and you start seeing bureaucracies get put into place. Originally, the lead person, the singular vision, the driving force and energy directs those bureaucracies, but over time, the bureaucracies develop interests of their own. That singular vision and purpose of the organization or civilization or whatever it is inevitably gets opened up to outside interests. As Land pointed out in that quote from before, anytime there's a disagreement inside the bureaucracy, there's also a chance to win. There's also a chance to conquer and gain power inside the organization. And quickly bureaucrats start being drawn to those issues, wedging them open wide to make sure that they can maximize their influence and their power inside the organization. Decisions stop being made solely in the interest of the health of the organization or the people that it serves or the interests that it serves, and instead is made in the interest of increasing power and carving out places for people inside the bureaucracy. in the end, a bureaucracy will always end up cannibalizing the organization that it runs due to this lack of unity, due to this introduction of outside interests that have nothing to do with the core mission of the organization, which is why it will always look like it's run by a cabal of its enemies, because the incentives of these bureaucrats will eventually become completely out of line with the things that actually benefit the organization, and they will tear it apart from the inside as they struggle for power and influence. And so we see the idea of the neutral institution is a myth. There are really only two types of institutions. There are those that are actively and explicitly holding to their values, fighting to protect and maintain its purpose. Or there are those in decay and decline. There is no middle ground here. Which is why it's so important that we understand that this is a natural process that we never truly escape. We never build the utopia. We never build the society that does not eventually decay and decline. We never just build this neutral institution that, if properly set up, runs perfectly forever. The best we can do is build something good and beautiful and true, and then protect it with everything we have, because Cthulhu always swims left. Thanks for watching, guys. If you liked the video, please go ahead and click like. If you haven't subscribed yet, now is a great time to do so. If you'd like to follow me on Twitter, or you'd like to support my work on Subscribestar like the wonderful people who are currently being displayed on the screen, you can do so by following the links that are in the description down below the video. I also have a merch store, so if you want to get a sticker or a mug and support the channel that way, you can follow that link in the description as well. I really appreciate you guys coming by and watching, and as always, I'll talk to you next time.